Welcome back to the Wallace branch, and a very important episode about the route covering the Bunker Hill and Sullivan Smelter complex. In thinking about modeling Wallace, I knew it was inevitable it would have to include the smelter. I had seen the smelter when it was operating in the 1980s, and it had these huge stacks. And people in eastern Washington have told me about how they could tell whether the wind was coming from the east by the level of smoke they were getting. The smelter was also a major landmark for the region, not just for the locals, but for anybody driving on I-90. And also the fact that the hills around the smelter had seemingly nothing left alive on them gave the whole area a sense of post-apocalyptic wasteland. The first smelter buildings were built in 1917, and before that, lead and silver ores were sent to a smelter in Washington. But in 1916, in response to a wartime increase in the demand for lead, Bunker Hill constructed this large lead smelter, and it finally opened on July 5th, 1917. It not only reduced the cost of handling the ore, but it gave the company a second major source of income from handling charges for ore from other mines in the whole region. I didn't have any detailed maps of the area to base my models on, so I had to use a combo of Google Maps, where you can clearly see the partial outline of the zinc plant up Government Gulch, and then this old 1980s USGS topographical survey, which isn't very detailed at all. So for both plants, I made a single gigantic model of each of them in Blender, and then I separated out a few of the detailed parts once I had the layout basically set. These are really big facilities, and the stacks need to be visible from far away, so I had to change the LOD distances in the config files, or else you can't really get a perspective on them at all. At this point, we see the start of the first gigantic concrete structure at the top of the hill, right next to the stacks, and it sort of looks like it might have been built at least in part in the days of horses and mules instead of cement trucks. Then you had some wooden structures typical of that era, and a brick building or two, a brick stack, and then I think most of the buildings were clad in metal. One thing that emerges from the photos is how the buildings definitely changed a lot over the years. I wanted to represent a mix of time periods and to have them be as extensive as possible. So what I ended up with is a bit of a mix. But most of what I built was based on the combination of the USGS map with the black and white photos from the 1970s that are on the Library of Congress webpage. For the smelter, huge pipes and stacks are just awesome to behold. The mixture of old and new I also find fascinating, and I like that the main smelter building is one of the few in the region to be made out of concrete. For a mining layout, I think it's important that the minerals have to go somewhere. This mining layout is inspired by real life, but also by the Jerome and Southwestern fictional layout of John Olson, who wrote the Kalmbach book, A Model Railroad with Personality. And one issue that I had as a kid when I looked at that layout was that the ore cars just went down the hill and out to a port somewhere on the coast, which that's not a criticism because smelters are gigantic, and this layout in that book was a single sheet of plywood with a little diorama extension for the port area. But in the book, Olson talked about the smelter in Clarkdale, Arizona, and I've looked it up and found some diagrams online, and it just looks like an absolute beast, just like this one in Kellogg. In terms of the mining industry, working on this modeling helped me understand a lot about the whole industrial history of the Silver Valley. What you see in photos sometimes appears a little bit haphazard, but ultimately everything is logical. Mines are accessing these veins and lodes deep underground, and then this one gigantic smelter is serving all of those mines. Put it in a national economic context, the smelter itself was part of a strategy to break up a big monopoly which was run by the Guggenheims, and this kind of established a kind of local monopoly in its place. Now, having a local smelter helped the economics of mining in the area, but I learned that a lot of the bigger mine operators in this region still felt that the smelter took too much of their value, so they set up these smaller concentrators nearer their mines to take out that one step of the process, and then potentially giving them the ability to shop around for other smelters to take their concentrated ores. some of the mines did ship their ores east to Helena, for example. The reason why there were so many huge building complexes near the mines back in the 1920s through the 1950s was partly due to these concentrators. The next building is the one I mentioned already, the structure in the center of the complex, which appears to be gone by the 1970s. In this one, I think Barnard Stockbridge photo, you can see that the building has some rail cars perhaps being unloaded. It also has a huge pipe that runs around its lower sides. I think it helps fill out the complex. The building also had an angled chute with windows, and that was held up by some sort of trestle type structure. These kind of buildings are some of the most tedious and difficult to do, but I wanted to include that element. Anyway, back to the smelter. For most of the life of these smelters, they had these very short, stubby stacks, and it was only in the 1970s, as public awareness and regulations about lead in the air began to grow, that the huge stacks were actually built. And it was trying to get the lead to spread out of the valley, although, and as anybody who grew up in a mountain valley would know, there are often winter air temperature inversions that make smokestacks ineffective in those weather conditions. The stacks only lasted about 20 years before they were finally demolished in the 1990s after the smelter had closed. And next, we turn to the most challenging part of the complex, this lower area of buildings, which must have at least 30 different roof lines, a bunch of small and large smokestacks, and lots of windows and doors on every side. The Library of Congress photos were my main guide for filling in this section. By the way, the Library of Congress photos are almost all backwards, and it took me a while to figure that out and get that right. I started with the largest building in the center, and then I moved to the big barn-like structures on the right, and then I finished with the smaller structures that cluster on the left. The left side also has this pretty brick smokestack and a complex structure of pipes that I assume were for cooling and recycling hot gases, but I don't really know. And this is getting into the most complicated parts of the smelter where you have a bunch of smaller buildings, this one building that has some interesting kind of cooling coil pipes sticking vertically into the air, and also a brick smokestack with a concrete foundation. Here's the small building where the large cooling pipes I mentioned are located. I enjoyed making these gigantic pipes, which I think were only added after the large stack was put up. So doing this smelter was my real motivation to try to learn how to do some PBR texture painting, which is much harder than just downloading a PBR texture and using it. And it's harder than just learning how to use PBR Painter in the first place. You really do need some trial and error. And what you see here on screen is a combination of using PBR Painter in Blender and also using some Blender nodes to do some of the PBR texturing. I start here by mixing an ambient occlusion node with the bevel node to put in some dark color on the edges and crevices. And this is not a method that I use anymore. It was just due to inexperience and following some YouTube videos, as well as trial and error, especially problems with baking the ambient occlusion using PBR Painter. I also used nodes to introduce some noise texture for some vertical rust streaks and also black marks. And finally, here I am painting on some additional black streaks and some top grunge here and there. When you paint it on, it may look overdone, but then you can always dial it back. I gather that most current Trainz asset creators, especially for things like locos where they're the focus of attention, they would have mastered PBR Painter or similar programs earlier on, but since I started with background buildings and other structures that didn't need it, I didn't learn it right away. These old rusted out metal pipes and machinery they don't look good unless you add some real detail based on their actual geometry and not just using downloaded textures. Then here with the big pipes, you can see I'm using the same exact steps, starting with the ambient occlusion, then moving on to use some noise texture for some rough patches in the metal, and then some smaller streaky rough patches using another noise texture, and then finally adding the black streaks, which I painted on using a stencil. You can see that the pipes were pretty streaky or dirty in the 1970s Library of Congress photos, even though I don't think that they were necessarily very old at that time. And with that, the asset is basically ready for placing. And then finally, it's time to go back into Trainz and put down the assets, which is a lot harder than it looks or than I imagined, partly because the UTM tiles don't show the location of the smelter buildings, and partly because somehow the UTM tiles got messed up, so they aren't conforming to the terrain. And one of the tiles even seems to be missing or deleted. So you're going to see me fussing around with the location a few times. There's no way to know for certain if the final layout is right or wrong, and maybe it doesn't really matter. As you've noticed, I didn't show the creation of every building on camera, just the main three. According to one article I read, the smelter had over 100 buildings that were demolished in the 1990s, although I guess that includes some buildings that probably had multiple different elements. As with the concentrator complex from the last episode, I don't have any resource or guide to the elevation of the tracks other than the USGS map. The USGS map does show that there were some tracks leading into the complex from both sides, and they followed the contours of the hillside. Today, everything on this entire hillside is all gone. One of the only things that isn't gone is the big tailings pile that heaped out in the valley, which I showed in the last episode. You can see that the valley looked entirely different originally, and it was starting to fill with tailings and contaminated soil by the early 1900s, and it was crisscrossed by different trackways to deliver more fill and tailings from the mines. And here's the baghouse and pipe complex that connects to the modern stack. Getting that positioned was another tedious task. A word about the Baghouse. This was the location of the worst incident of lead pollution in recorded history, which took place in 1973, not long after passage of the Clean Air Act and the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. According to Prevention Web, a website hosted by the United Nations, on September 3, 1973, a fire swept through the baghouse of the Bunker Hill mine. The baghouse was designed to filter pollutants produced by smelting. The gases produced in this process carry lead, arsenic, and mercury. At the time, the prices of lead and silver were climbing towards all-time highs, and the company decided to operate the smelter despite the destruction of the baghouse. According to the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, a division within the United States Center for Disease Control, the smelter poured an average of 73 tons of lead each month into Smelterville and surrounding Kellogg neighborhoods from September 1973 until August 1974, when it was shut down. Soon, horses in the area began dying, and when data on children's blood lead levels began to arrive in September 1974, a year after the fire, the results were shocking. The fire became one of the largest single incidents of lead poisoning in U.S. history. According to the Shoshone News Press, the Kellogg area celebrated the 50th anniversary of the disaster in 2024, and the article notes that in 1974, after testing 175 children living within a mile of the smelter, 173 or 99% of them reported blood levels of over 40 micrograms per deciliter or greater, and the average was 67. The safe level is considered 5 micrograms per deciliter, and anything above 45 is considered to require chelation therapy, which itself has some serious side effects. Armed at the time with limited authority, health and environmental agencies worked to reduce kids' exposure to lead, soil, and dust, and that work did have some immediate results. By 1981, only 19% of Smelterville children tested had blood levels that exceeded that era's national average. In 1983, the EPA listed the Bunker Hill Mining and Metallurgical Complex as a Superfund site, starting with the most polluted area right around the plant known as the Box. Expanded in 2002, the Superfund site includes environmental cleanup and restoration work, and it covers 1,500 square miles. It is one of the largest Superfund sites in the United States. 50 years later, the average blood lead level for children is 2 micrograms per deciliter. And according to Mary Renberg of the Panhandle Health District, quote, "We made a lot of progress and blood lead levels are going down, but the problem is still ongoing." Of course, closing the smelter had a devastating economic impact on the area, and in many ways, the economy has never recovered. Even though environmental remediation itself does create jobs and helps foster the recreation industry that powers the region today. Finally, after the tracks are mostly down and buildings look okay, it's time to add some textures, some clutter, and a few outlying buildings and sheds. I'm just going to show the initial effort here, and again, details are an iterative process, not something to do all in one sitting. Here's the rather fancy-looking administration building. It seems to be just at the end of a couple of spur tracks on the USGS map. Maybe at one time those tracks connected through. Yes, some of these roads and parking areas are on steep slopes, probably too steep. And the very last task is connecting the smelter up to some of the main roads, in some cases using the same road spline asset from the highways. I tried to roughly follow the present road path, but I didn't go for 100% accuracy. This whole area is now all on sale for plots for homes. Personally, I wouldn't want to live there, even if this is near a golf course now and has some good views. And there you have it, one of the most important sets of assets in the entire layout, and definitely a major operational component. Mostly done, ready to go. Of course, we're only halfway done with the entire smelter complex, since in the next episode we'll be turning to the zinc plant, which is just up the valley. So if you're interested in joining, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on the Wallace branch.